Good morning. Happy to be here. So I have a few questions that I prepared, but at the same time, I'll throw it out to the audience every so often for questions you might have as the discussion proceeds. So the first question I have, and I think Dr. Lovett had dealt with this a little bit in his keynote address. The question is, for all three of you, what were your views of U.S. policies and approaches during the war, and how, if at all, has it changed over the ensuing years? And I figured maybe we could start with Mac, who I understood from, I'm not sure where I saw this, but I think just returned from Vietnam about a year ago, or went back to Vietnam about a year ago.
Oh, that's Rick, who's on later today at 3:10.
Oh. Well, my research, so I'm a great historian. My research is... Well, anyway, so we'll just go with the basic question. How...
Well, I think when you're in Vietnam as a little ant, you know, as whether you're an enlisted guy or a junior officer, you're putting in your year over there, and policy issues are not. Although Vietnamization of the war was going on when I was there, and I was there from August of '70 to July of '71, and so units were leaving, and we were always hoping that we would be next, but it never happened. Of course, we were there for the full year, but. And when we were there, we did invade Laos. The Air Force supported that, so the war was going hot and heavy. But I think there was no, the numbers of casualties were down, but during the Nixon administration, when he was elected, in 1968, took office in '69. During his, he had a plan to end the war, but it took 5 years. But it was victory with honor, I think was his policy, and most Americans probably supported that. But another 21,000 people died during those 5 years, so it was still going strong. But I think I didn't really focus on Vietnam policy until years later, as a student of history, and then most recently the Ken Burns series. At first I wasn't going to watch it. I thought, no, I don't want to go down that journey again, but my wife and I sat down and watched it, and it was really revealing and reassuring and reaffirming, and it was one thing that struck me was when a North Vietnamese official talked about how maybe we should have made peace earlier because the South would have fallen eventually because of corruption, and we wouldn't have lost the additional 1 million lives that the Vietnamese lost. We paid a big price with our 58,000 men, and I think 8 women who died in Vietnam. But I think the Vietnamese realized finally, in retrospect, that maybe they should have declared peace early and gotten it over. But I think when I was there, Vietnam policy wasn't much on my mind, but here lately it has been.
Yeah, I agree with Mac's analysis, because when I was there, all you thought about was getting home, what your dear estate was. You had a short time calendar, counting off the days. And one day, after a massive troop withdrawal announcement by President Nixon, I was in a consolidated mess with a few of my other members of my unit. And Bill Plant was there, CBS News. He was a war correspondent. And he wanted to know how we felt about this latest troop drop. And I wanted to tell him the truth. Why in the hell did he send me when you're reducing the number of troops being sent to Vietnam? But he was with a lieutenant colonel, a public affairs officer. And I thought if I told him the truth, I may be reassigned to the DMZ. So I kept my mouth shut.
I was just going to add that the 1-year tour of duty, that was something new. In Korea, I'm not sure whether people went for the duration. I think maybe they did, unless they were so many missions in an airplane or some kind of combat duty. But in World War II, when you joined, you were gone for 2 years, 3 years, as long as it took. Vietnam was different. When I was getting on the plane at Travis Air Force Base, like many of us did, we were getting on the same plane. There were veterans coming home. They were walking down this side of the aisleway. We were walking over here, and they were all sorts of uniforms, from Class A's to fatigues that were torn and tattered. Some of them were, they were sunburned, they were blistered, and and they were kind of looking at us with that distant stare. We could tell they had pity on us, I think, because we were going the other way. And in fact, one of them kind of grinned and said, "Oh my God, 365 and a wake up." If you know what that means, 1 year and a wake up is that you're going to be over there. So that was kind of a haunting thing to hear that.
Well, for me, I guess before I went over I was drafted in the Army in 1966, November 66. Before that time, I've been more or less kind of pro our involvement in Vietnam. In fact, one point I put a bumper sticker, "Back our boys in Vietnam." So I went, and of course, when the time they hit you, once we arrived, I went through basic Fort Bliss, Texas, and then Fort Polk. When I got word of Fort Polk, I knew pretty much where I was going after that, because, oh no, you'll probably go to Germany. Well, it's funny thing is Germany was tropical, had palm trees and kind of a humid climate, so a long ways from Germany. But anyway, the CO at Fort Polk told us, "You men are going to Vietnam." The first night we got there, and so you just go up and say, "Okay, this is the way it is." So you just kind of squared yourself to being ready to go and learn the training, the weapons training, and so forth. And when we went, you just kind of the idea was just get through each day, survive. And during the year over in our infantry company, we very seldom ever talk politics or policy, anything else. So most of them would say, "Well, we got to keep the communists from winning," and that type of thing. But most of the time, about the closest thing anything came, and I think the famous boxer Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, was deprived of his boxing title. Most of the guys, whites and blacks alike, said, "Well, we know who really won number one." They didn't decry or complain about him not going. They knew he was the best boxer, but we really didn't get into politics or policy that much. When I came home, I went through a period of disillusionment a little bit. Mild. I put a Eugene McCarthy bumper sticker on the car, but since that time, I've kind of gone through periods of adjustment and reading and evaluating and sorting things out, which is still ongoing today. So trying to look at it from a historical standpoint. So I'm still trying to find where I am on it at this time.
One of the things I found myself thinking about when trying to come up with questions is I recalled a conversation I had with a Air Force fighter pilot who was flying missions I think in the late 60s. And he had recalled at the time and sharing with one of his other pilots that some serious misgivings about the South Vietnamese regime. And so sort of in the moment, like not looking back and saying, So I'm wondering to what extent, when you guys were there, does that kind of thought enter your mind, or is it just focused entirely on this is what we got to do, or did you find yourself thinking about who this other regime was that you were supposedly there to assist?
I had a considerable amount of contact with South Vietnamese. Because as an MP, we do these combined patrols with the QCs and the National Police. And we would sometimes try to take care of these Amerasian children that were basically conceived of from Vietnamese women and American GIs. They were often abandoned by the Vietnamese themselves. And occasionally the National Police would try to interfere with our efforts to provide some sort of comfort for them, like Christmas dinners or Thanksgiving dinners, and it's always been a problem, relating to the Vietnamese, because you had so many American GIs that were there. They had no sense of say, cultural awareness. We weren't given courses in basic training about what the Vietnamese were like, or who they really were, or who we were really fighting for. And many of the young men that I was with that were 18 years old, 19 years old, didn't really understand that. And occasionally there would be all sorts of racial and ethnic slurs directed at the Vietnamese. A commonly told joke when I was there was the Vietnamese are like their flag. Most of them are yellow and the rest of them are red. And they just didn't know. I was an old man. I was about 24 years old, 23, 24. And so I was a little more attuned to exactly what was going on. I spent some spare time in libraries rather than going down downtown. So, you know, that was part and parcel of the problem.
Well, I was in Air Force Intelligence, and I was at headquarters, 7th Air Force, which was a compound on Thompson Air Base, and I was inside 7th Air Force compound. It was an intelligence compound, so I was in a compound within a compound, and there were no Vietnamese nationals working there because of security clearances. I couldn't travel outside of Saigon because of a security clearance that I had, but I would go down to Saigon every once in a while with some buddies for dinner. We had curfew we could go from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. We had to be back on Thompson at 10. So, but going downtown, riding in a cyclo, which is that basket, riding in front, you're the bumper, and it was quite and then walking around, you're a head taller than everybody, and you had to wear your uniform when you were off base, which was, I always thought, why don't you paint a target on your back? But one thing, the QC, Quan Con, I think, the Vietnamese MPs were very, very tough, and they would be on every street corner with the rifles and machine guns, and if you're riding in one of those cyclos and you heard a whistle blow, they slammed on the brakes and stopped, no matter what, because those guys would shoot. They would maybe they were looking for those deserters, or something, and they would shoot. So they were I think they were tough, but I had very little contact with the Vietnamese in that regard. And we used the derogatory terms for them, which is very unfortunate. And I didn't do that, but some of my people I worked with did. So.
No, I don't think, as an infantry, we're trained as infantry, we were not given training to function within another culture. We were strictly giving them training in military courage, discipline, weapons, tactics, that type of thing. At Fort Polk, I remember I think they gave us a handbook of a few Vietnamese words and that type of thing. Basically, you see a film and showing German troops marching into Munich. So we have the Munich theory, which eventually morphed into the Domino theory, which I hope eventually we'll talk a little bit more about that. But as far as understanding the people whose hearts and minds we're trying to win, the average soldier, I don't think, was trained to do that. We were operating out in Central Highlands for 3/4 of our tour, and you'd encounter villages, see kids. Sometimes we'd see them on the road, and they'd be begging for food. And I just remember, they were kind of GI savage, and they knew the language. You pick up a lot of pidgin language, and chop chop, number 1, number 10. Number 1 was the best, number 10 was the worst. And I remember our sea rations I kind of like the sea rations the most part. There's one kind, date pudding, which I thought was totally god-awful. One time I tried to give one can of sea ration to a little Vietnamese kid, and he said, number 10. That was one shrewd, wise little guy. So they have a savvy about them. I never had any hard feeling about the Vietnamese people, but some guys that call them gooks and that type of thing, I think it came out of just not adequate training and preparing for another culture. There was a letter in we got tremendous documents in our holding. In 1965, a letter from an Air Force officer to Jackie Cochran, and this officer says, we may win the war militarily, we're going to lose it because we can't speak the language. We couldn't. We could, the VC could. So that gave the VC and the NBA an advantage. The language, they could reach the people, the peasants, the farmers, that we couldn't. And I don't think that always filtered at all different levels enough. So culturally, I think that's where he kind of fell down.
I'd forgotten about this, and I need to mention this. I had the opportunity to meet a Vietnamese family when I was over there. My mother's cousin had been stationed there as a civilian with USAID, and he had a Vietnamese interpreter traveling around with him, and then he was injured in a plane crash, left, but he wanted me to meet this Trong family. And I did that when I was there, and I had dinner with them a few times at their place. I would ride the cyclo down to Cholan, the Chinese part of Saigon, and walk. He would meet me at the street. I'd walk down a back alley where I think a Caucasian maybe never been before. Got the stairs from all the people there, and I would have a dinner with them. And he had 5 kids. Fast forward to 15 years later, got a call from my cousin, who was now down in Iowa, Kansas, and saying this family, the oldest daughter, who was 15 when I met her, was now 30, had left. She and her husband and two boys had gotten out of Vietnam, got to a refugee camp in Malaysia, and they were in the Philippines, and then you had sponsors to come to the U.S. So, long story short, we helped them resettle. They came here, they stayed in Kansas for a few months, and now they're in San Jose. They've had two more kids. And Uncle Mac, I got to name the two kids that were born. You know, so that was actually a nice little closure for me in that regard.
You know, when the war ended, after 1975, you had a massive influx of Vietnamese refugees into the United States. And I was teaching at Topeka High School at that time, and we had former Vietnamese officers, field grade officers working as custodians. We had bilingual students that were being integrated into Topeka High School. And one, I took aside and I told him, you can't feel sorry for yourself anymore because you'll probably never go back to Vietnam. And you have to get ready for the real world. This is going to be your life. And about 9 years later, I was at Topeka Public Post Office in downtown Topeka, and there he was. He was working on a PhD in physics at MIT. And, it's amazing what happened when they eventually arrived in the United States. But I'd like to make a point that David brought up. We're talking about why we got there, and he mentioned like Munich and the Germans, because that was really a problem that American policymakers were driven by. This fear that if you didn't stand up to aggression somewhere in the world, basically, then this would lead to further aggression. This became known as the domino theory, and this really became a real issue. Because even if you take a look at, I think, if I remember correctly, Beadle Smith was at Geneva when they were negotiating the Geneva Accords in 1954, and it's raining. And he wouldn't use an umbrella because basically that would be like Neville Chamberlain arriving back from Munich. And we were driven by what is sometimes called the Munich metaphor, And that was only one issue. Another problem was China, because most of the policymakers didn't really understand what Vietnam was all about. They thought the Kremlin ran everything. Their tentacles ran. It was how do they call it? The Moscow, Peking, Hanoi axis. They thought it was all part of a well-conceived plan, but understanding the divisions between the Chinese and the Russians.
You want?
Actually, one of my questions actually goes right into this issue, was how do you all see, both as veterans and then sort of looking at this from sort of the more either from the library side or the history side, how do you see the Vietnam War and the policies that led to it as reflective of larger patterns or larger context of American foreign policy and interventions over the course of its history? Is it reflective of it? Was it a turning point? Was it an exception? Where do you see it sort of fitting in that bigger history?
I sort of see it as a continuum. You can go back to the Truman Doctrine in the 1940s after World War II. Once you become engaged, how do you become disengaged? How do you walk away from Vietnam? I met a fellow named William H. Goodell. David knows who he is. And Bill Goodell told me, he said, what Truman did sometimes was pass on the problem to Eisenhower. And Eisenhower then passed the problem on to Kennedy. And Kennedy's sudden death passed the problem on to Johnson. But it was leading down that one road to basically further and further commitment to Vietnam. That's why it drives me crazy when certain documents are leaked from the Kennedy Presidential Library indicating that Kennedy, if he lived, he would never have sent troops on the scale that Johnson did to Vietnam.
I guess to look at the whole global picture, take a look at 1945, World War II ended, Soviet Union and the United States emerged as the most powerful nations on earth, and Eisenhower went to Moscow in the summer and got to witness a parade, and dictators seemed to like parades, and Joseph Stalin was certainly no exception. He marched for 5 hours. He watched the pride of the Soviet military might go by, and Eisenhower knew darn well what the Soviets had indeed torn the guts out of the German army, and he appreciated power, so he must have been impressed by power. And then the rhetoric became more hostile, so we became afraid. And there was genuine reason to be afraid. And the Soviets started taking actions in Berlin when they tried to blockade access to Berlin. We carried out the Berlin airlift. Of course, a lot of the issues, the early issues between the U.S., the West, and Russia involved Germany. And then meanwhile, Europe is in a mess. France is a mess. France had to call in Indochina, and they were determined to go back. And although FDR had some reservations about that, he died, and Truman wasn't in a position to stab or to weaken France any further. They're pretty weak anyway by forcing them out of the colony. So France came back, took over the colony. 1946, hostilities broke out. The First Indochina War occurred, and we, of course, graduated back to French. And then you take it down after that. China fell under Mao Zedong. The Korean War broke out. We thought communism was on the march throughout Asia. That was a perspective. So obviously the dominoes are starting to fall. And then in 1951, a message from then Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, Dean Rusk, who 10 years later became Secretary of State, said, if Vietnam falls and the rest of them will fall. So there's your domino theory right there. So the Truman administration bought it. There has been a variation of Truman Doctrine and so on, all the way back to 46, 47. And then the French, when Eisenhower went over as Supreme Allied Commander to build the force for NATO, the French immediately took him aside and said, we're fighting this for in Indochina, not for us, but for you. If Vietnam falls, Indochina falls, Siam, Thailand, the Philippines. So that he had, by the time he enunciated in 1954, he's well aware of, and he's announced it in a press conference, if Vietnam falls, then the rest of Southeast Asia is going to be weakened too. So that's kind of your domino theory.
Yeah. I think since we're on the hollow ground of the Eisenhower Library, we do need to talk about Ike's role in this. And he had advisors there. 800, I think, was maybe the number by the time the end of the administration. But Eisenhower always said that a land war in Asia would swallow up our army division by division. And he was astute when, of course, he was probably thinking more of China than Indochina. But he also he got very frustrated with how the war was carried on later when he was out of office. He kept us out while he was in office, generally. But he said, never send a battalion to take a hill if a regiment is available. He used overwhelming force, and that's what he did at Little Rock. He had 1,000 paratroopers with bayonets, not some federal marshals integrating the high school there. And he also said, I will never commit our forces to battle where I cannot get to the heart of the enemy's power and support. If I can't get to their power and support. He said that in 1956, and he was talking about China and Russia supplying North Vietnam. If we can't stop that, then it's a hopeless cause. And JFK, when he was inaugurated in his glorious inauguration speech, which is quoted by all his fans and followers, he said, let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century. Ike was born in 1890, but there's a new generation born in this century, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace and proud of our ancient heritage and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we will pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardships, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty. And he was advised by a cadre of groups. He didn't believe in Ike's staffing pattern where you had military advisors and senior advisors giving you tempered advice, and although Ike had the final say, of course, but it was more like a college dorm room, a seminar, and he had the best and the brightest, and he didn't feel that he had the need for Ike's staff apparatus. So he was surrounded by Robert McNamara, Bundy, and Rusk, and Maxwell Taylor. And they carried with them an exciting, this is what David Halberstam said. He wrote a book called The Best and the Brightest in 1969. He was the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who'd been in Vietnam. This group of the best and the brightest, they carried with them an exciting sense of American elitism, a sense that the best men had been summoned forth from the country to harness this dream to a new American nationalism, bringing a new, strong, dynamic spirit to our historic role in world affairs, to bring the American dream to reality elsewhere in the world, to bring the American dream to reality elsewhere in the world. Now, Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker of the House at this time, kind of shook his head, and he said to anybody who would listen, said, I'd feel a whole lot better about that group if just one of them had run for sheriff ever. They didn't have their feet on the ground. So I think, and Ike was giving advice to Kennedy and Johnson during the early stages of the war. But he finally washed his hands of the whole thing and said, I'm not going to come out against the war. A former president doesn't do that. Lesson to the world. And so he just zipped it, but he knew that LBJ was, by limiting what our options were, was fighting a losing battle, and you all were eyewitnesses to that.
I have to give it to President Eisenhower, because in 1954, the French were facing a crisis at the Dien Phu, and they were surrounded. It was one of the most horrible plans you came up with, and they realized that their bastion at Dien Phu was about to fall. So they requested American military aid, and they flew their chief of staff their command staff to Washington to discuss an option. And one option was bombing missions with American B-29s flying out of the Philippines. It was called Operation Vulture, including atomic weapons to rescue the French garrison at Dien Phu. To Eisenhower's credit, he said no. He said no. Lyndon Johnson was opposed to it. Admiral Radford was in favor of it, and I have to give President Eisenhower a great deal of credit, because if he realized that once you did that, the next step was deploying American ground troops, and it just wasn't going to happen. We have to go back to remember MacArthur, when MacArthur testified before the joint House, Senate, Foreign, and Armed Services Committees after he was recalled. And he spoke, I think, for 2 or 3 days. Omar Bradley followed him in closed section. And his concluding remark was, this would be the wrong war at the wrong place against the wrong enemy. And Matthew B. Ridgway and General Eisenhower probably would agree with that, too.
I might just say a few things. There was a lot of continuity from Truman through Eisenhower on into Kennedy, where the first American military assistance group was sent to Indochina in 1950, the Truman administration. And then and during the Eisenhower administration, a lot of things did happen. The French were defeated in Dien Phu. A Geneva Conference was convened in 1954, and at the behest of the Soviet Union, China, agreements made to divide Vietnam into two, North and South Vietnam, and with understanding elections to be held in 1956 to decide the fate of the country. The elections were never held. The French withdrew, but the U.S. then made a decision to build a viable non-communist state in South Vietnam, and they had to make a decision to find a person to do that. In 1951, the Truman administration thought it would be Bao Dai, a former emperor of Vietnam. Well, after there was an interesting story, and I don't have time to tell it all, but the decision was made to back Ngo Dinh Diem, and in the fall of '54, Eisenhower sent a mission to boost Diem. It was led by one of his wartime corps commanders, J. Lawton Collins, known as Lightning Joe. So Collins came over in November '54. He said, we're here to back Ngo Dinh Diem, make no mistake about that. 6 months later, came back to Eisenhower and reported personally to him, Jim can't cut it. It's a mistake. We should pick someone else. So the Eisenhower administration was almost ready to turn it to someone else. They sent cables to that fact to their embassy in Saigon, and then a riot broke out of sex, which Jim was able to quell this. Then the cables sent to change her policy were blocked, and the decision made to back Ngo Dinh Diem. So from there on, it's swim or sink with Ngo Dinh Diem. And Eisenhower never gave up on Diem, even in August '63. It was a fascinating document or post-presidential papers talking about that while the Kennedy administration was divided on him, and one section wanted to overthrow him, Eisenhower caused a mistake, and he mentioned rather classic a couple of newsmen, probably Halberstone and Sheehan, who were trying to deliver a single-handed overthrow to him. So that's a very fascinating document. Of course, 2 months later, Jim was overthrown and murdered. But Eisenhower never gave up on him. In February, he held LBJ's hand as Johnson in February '65. LBJ called him in, he had a nice conversation, and Johnson asked him how you settled Korea, and Eisenhower gave him his version. So from then on, you'd see communication Johnson and Eisenhower, but he was involved all the way up to almost the end of his life.
You know, there's one thing I want to mention. Kansas is the center of it all, because Lucien Conein was the CIA, one of the CIA operatives working in Saigon that was the liaison between the CIA and the colonels that were toppling Diem. And he was a Kansas boy. He was from Kansas City. He was in Company D, I think the 137th Infantry. He had dual citizenship. Later on, he goes to serve in France, escaped France, you know, to the fall of France. And he contended that if he was in charge of the Watergate, no one would have ever known it even happened.
I have a question specifically for Chris, and then I have one for the library side of the table. But for you, Chris, as a trained historian who also was in Vietnam and has to teach the subject, I can imagine how in many ways that's an asset and like really an opportunity to keep the students engaged when you're teaching it. But I also wonder, are there any doubts or any complications of having that close connection to the conflict when you're trying to deal with it in the classroom?
To be objective.
Yes.
Yeah, to read the objective question. I really try to be objective about the war. I've taught the course numerous times. Probably the best format that I handled to teach the course was I ran a workshop at Fort Hays. Intensive. It was a week long, 10 hours each day, a couple hours each evening watching videos and bringing in speakers, veterans, anti-war activists, Laotian and Vietnamese immigrants that remember the war. And I try not to be pulled into it, but occasionally students would ask me, you know, where did you stand on this thing? I mean, you know, I said, upon reflection, looking at it, in 20/20 hindsight, it was a mistake to ever get involved. It wasn't a mistake that we lost the war, you know, but you lost 58,000 men plus eight women. It's nearing almost 59,000. And I said, you can't go to the wall without being touched by what actually happened. And the men that made the decision to go to Vietnam, they weren't evil men. They weren't, you know, malevolent forces. They actually thought they were doing the right thing, given the information that they had at the time. I met William H. Goodell, a man we don't even know. Goodell actually knew Ngo Dinh Diem. He was basically opposed to toppling him. He developed the M16 rifle for the Army. He also was an advocate of using defoliants in Vietnam. And they never thought of the long-term consequences of what their actions really were. There was no real reflection. George Ball, an official in the Kennedy Johnson administrations, he was the in-house dove. He was trying to get them to see reason, see the other side of the coin. And no one would listen to him. But there was no voices basically questioning some of the actions that were being taken. I mean, first of all, you remember H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor? He wrote a book called Dereliction of Duty, in which he held the staff and Robert McNamara responsible for what actually occurred. But who in the Joint Chiefs of Staff were telling the civilian leaders that this wasn't going to work? Where were their voices? They were silent. They only thought about winning. Not that they were evil men, but that's how they looked at the war and how they looked at policymaking. And Johnson never really was serious about withdrawing. You know, and that's the tragedy of it too. So you really try to blend an idea of objectivity and also trying to do some serious analysis involved as well.
I think one of the other things I had on my mind, in addition to the objectivity question, was also the perceptions among the students of your.
Oh,
For example, when I ever teach anything that's like not in my lifetime, they feel more comfortable in saying, well, why that interpretation? Why not this? Will they question you on, well, why that? If you were there, do you sort of come with this sense of authority because you were there?
What's really problematic, has been problematic, is that some students want to believe that we could have won the war. And this is a question we really have to ask ourselves. Could we really have won the Vietnam War? And my response to my students who ask me that question, who think that we could have won, I said, but at what price and at what cost, and could we respect ourselves in the morning? And of course we could have. We could have bombed North Vietnam back to the Stone Age. We could have destroyed all their dikes. We could have made life almost totally miserable. But the Vietnamese at that point, under Lee Duan, they weren't going to give up no matter what. They weren't going to give up no matter what. Were we willing to do what Tacitus said, turn Vietnam into a jungle and call it peace? I mean, into a desert and call it peace. Were we willing to do that? And the answer was no. Americans like to be liked. They really want to be loved. You know, it's like almost a story out of, say, Tim O'Brien. If anyone ever read Tim O'Brien, his book, The Things They Carried, the best one is the one I like is the Sweetheart of Saint Traban. You know, where this fantasy among veterans is to bring your girlfriend to Vietnam. And she arrives in country and she's virginal and she's wearing white culottes and a pink sweater. And that's us. That's the way we saw ourselves as Americans. But by the end of the tour, when she's ready to go home, her boyfriend's trying to bring her back from being with the Special Forces, and she's got a necklace. She's all dressed up the way she was, but a tongue made of human, a necklace made of human ears and human tongues. And this was us. This is what the war did to us. It really would destroy our self-image and our self-esteem. So that's the question I try to present to my students.
And then putting it to the library side of the equation, in your time working in the library and in the archive side, and researchers and scholars or just public come in interested in Vietnam, has the type of interest, the type of questions people are asking about Vietnam, the subjects they're looking at, the archives they want, has that changed over time? And have you noticed any sort of patterns in when it's at a high point, when it's at a low point, and in terms of interest in Vietnam and people coming to, say, this place to do some work on it?
Well, there's been some. I was trying to think. We haven't actually had just people knocking down the doors. We've had a number. There's been a fair amount of pretty significant. I wouldn't downplay it. Also, some really good, solid scholarship done, and some of them based on research in our library. I would say this: Eisenhower Library has some really tremendous collections for anyone who wants to understand the whole history of U.S. involvement need to come out. The J. Lawton Collins papers just by themselves gives you a remarkably detailed look at a 6 month period of time, because he's really in there trying to build an army for Jim and work with the SEC, to understand there's intelligence reports, cables, a tremendous amount of details that period. And we have all sorts of documents on Southeast Asia and negotiations. And we've had a number of people trying to figure out the rather enigmatic No Din Jim. And there's one book I haven't had a chance to read yet, but according to this author, I'm sure she was out here, and I know she was, she placed mandatory declassification reviews. But she says Jim wasn't quite the monster people made him out to be. He's actually rather skilled. And another article I did read was on the same line, and on the external side, he's pretty skilled. He managed to establish South Vietnam and credibility among the international community. He managed to get the powers that be to forget about any elections, because there was no way he wanted to have an election, because he knew, and Eisenhower admitted in his memoirs, that North Vietnamese Ho Chi Minh would win. So he got that scrapped, and he managed also, according to one reviewer said, the Chapman's book built Uncle Sam into giving him lots of aid while balking at Uncle Sam trying to tell him what to do. So he's kind of strong-minded, independent. But Jim, so that's the type of scholarships. There's been some interest. I've had at least some special access researchers go in and work on studies. One, as far as I know, is still classified today if they ever got it put together. We have a few things in Vietnam will be what I call daisy documents. They'll still be classified when I'm pushing up
No,
daisies.
please.
There's some sources, people maybe still have relatives still in Vietnam and some are intelligence methods, but there's scholarships, there's still interest there, and it's justifiable. There's still a lot of things, and I don't think they've covered it all yet.
I'll tell a little story about, in the presidential library system, I was a deputy director, so I would go to conferences periodically or meetings with the other library counterparts, and the Kennedy Library was wont to blame Eisenhower for getting us into Vietnam and then taking full credit for the space race. And so, the staff at our Eisenhower Library was really open to, we didn't have an agenda to push. We opened the documents. You could come and try to debunk some Eisenhower myth if you wanted to, and the staff here was just totally professional about it. Kennedy Library, not so much. But I think in these meetings with them, I would always jokingly tell them, okay, I said, if you're willing to give Ike credit for the space race, we'll take the blame for Vietnam. We work out that deal, and nobody ever took me up on the offer.
Sir, I got 2 questions.
Actually, I was going to ask, is the microphone available? Because I think it's a good time to send it out to...
One of them is that
Wait a minute till the mic, wait till the mic comes.
Behind you.
I applaud the knowledge of the gentleman up there. Really nice. Policy, you got to know about policy. But the average EI doesn't really follow policy. He gets to do the dirty work at the end. And it's up to the big guys up there to make the right decisions, and we'll follow through regardless. You have not touched a Jane Fonda yet, which everybody here knows that we will pay her anyway.
Or John Kerry.
And he came in later. But the other question is, has the CIA ever decoded the word boom, 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 boom? Everybody knows, right? Raise your hands if you know what boom, 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 boom is.
We all know.
Just to lighten up the conversation anyway. But you,
Since you brought up Jane Fonda, let me say, I was at a VFW hall, maybe in Emporia, I don't know where it was, and I went to the restroom, and there in the urinal was Jane Fonda's image. Have any of you ever experienced that? And I thought, so just yesterday, I was thinking, did I imagine that? Or is that, so I went online, the computer answers everything, and we have, these are targets, these are decals that you can get in Amazon. Hanoi Jane urinal targets, a package of 5, costs $9.95 plus $3.58 shipping. And it's not eligible for Amazon Prime, so you are going to have to pay for the shipping costs. And if you order today, you get it between April 17th and 19th. So it wasn't my imagination, but this is a decal. It's 4.5 inches in diameter. You paste it at the bottom of the urinal, and then you pay your respects in that way to Jane Fonda.
You know, one of the interesting things that happens is that we take a look at, because someone mentioned the case of John Kerry. John Kerry's, problem for many Vietnam veterans was that he appeared and opposed the Vietnam War after he was a Vietnam veteran, and he threw away his medals. That was the issue. Now, if you take a look at John Kerry, he earned those medals that he had. He was no coward. If you take a look at American politicians, Bill Clinton, Donald J. Trump, most of the members of Congress, none of them ever served, particularly their Vietnam era. Matter of fact, there was a joke I heard the other day. It went something like this: what does Jane Fonda have on Donald Trump? At least she went to Vietnam. So we have to put all this in perspective.
Rick Williams and I were at a reception one time with a young man who was actually campaigning for John Kerry in 2004, would that be? You remember that, Rick? And he was from Chicago, and he was, a lovely guy. We like him, we know his family. But he was saying he thought allowed us out. We thought John Kerry was going to get the veteran vote. And Rick and I looked at each other and said, are you crazy? He's not going to get the veteran vote. Well, he fought over there and he got 3 Purple Hearts. Well, that is true. You can't deny that he was but then he came back and joined the anti-war protest, and that was it. It didn't work for Marlene Dietrich in Germany. It didn't work for John Kerry. It didn't work for Jane Fonda. So he may have been shown bravery, but in the final analysis, when he did that, he lost the support of people, and I think that could have possibly cost him that election.
Oh, it did. It did, by far. I mean, when he didn't respond to the Swift boat attack ads at all, and allow those things to basically run. I told my brother, who was a union president in New Jersey, I said, he's lost. The election's over. And I was right.
Do we have up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that after Vietnam, I came home and kind of blended into the community and kind of thought I wanted to forget things, but years later I began to try to make sense of my tour in Vietnam, and now I'm really big into learning as much as I can. I've learned a lot today. But I was curious if you guys have ever seen the book called Vietnam, A History. Big, thick book.
Oh, by Stanley Carnam?
I don't remember who. There? No, that's not it.
That's one of them.
Yeah, that's the kid version.
You'll learn a lot.
Yeah.
But Stanley Carnam.
I've got that book, and there's a lot of information in it. One of the things that I struggle with, and it's been mentioned today about us losing the war, and I've never accepted that because with all my studies that I've looked at, I found that we didn't lose any major battle.
No, we never
We
did.
won them all. And then you look at the casualties, we lost over 58,000. And I went back to Vietnam in 2000 and actually got to meet with the vice president of the country. And she shared with us that they lost 3 million. I've been told 1 million. First I was told 600,000, then 1 million. Now I think now the United States recognizes 1.5 million, but she told us they lost 3 million. And just doing the math, I'm thinking, we lose that war? I don't think so. The other thing is, which was fascinating, going over in 2000, still a communist country. Communism is so great, except they're one of the most poorest countries in the world today. And the young people, we ended up having like 25-year-olds that drove the Sickolos and took us around the different things we did. And they were very careful. They'd look around and then they'd tell me that they'd point at a policeman and say, they say America's very bad. We know America's very good. And it's fascinating to see the visuals. But one of the things in the book that I was fascinated, just love to hear your comment, but he quoted Ho Chi Minh as saying, we cannot beat the Americans. They're too big, they're too strong, they're too well equipped. But he says, all we have to do is hold on and they'll go home. And that's kind of how I see the war.
That's a good point. Harry Summers, he was a colonel in the U.S. Army, I think a colonel. He wrote a book called On Vietnam, a critical analysis of what happened during the war. And in the book begins with a little vignette he tells. He is sent to Hanoi in 1973, at the time you're bringing back the PWs. And he goes to his Vietnamese counterpart. He says, you never beat us in battle. And his Vietnamese counterpart said, that's true, but it's totally irrelevant. And what he was getting at was that we live in an open society. North Vietnam was a closed society. We saw the news on a daily basis. The American people saw the news on a daily basis. And basically, an army cannot win if there's no one back home that basically supports your war effort. And the country was hopelessly divided because of Vietnam.
Eisenhower mentioned when he was leaving office, he mentioned or warned against a military-industrial complex. And then in Vietnam, we had some of the great leaders like McNamara, who I think came from the auto industry. What was the role, what was the influence of the military-industrial complex during Vietnam?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, if you take a look at the defense industry in the United States, take a look at basically the defense industry likes to put plants in almost every congressional district. And so that they always have an argument to spend more and more and more money on military weapon systems. So there's always this thing ginned up. I think Eisenhower realized the danger of that. If you take a look at Eisenhower's writings, and David could talk about this, is that Eisenhower basically was, I wouldn't say a skinflint, but basically was concerned about budgets. You know, he wrote a study about military mobilization in case of war, and he knew about American industrial planning. And I don't think he really wanted to waste any more money on defense systems that were unnecessary. But the power that they have in Congress, calling it a job program, is a way to maintain more and more weapon systems.
I've always thought that when the military industrial complex or the war effort, the war industry, like the war in Afghanistan cost us $1 trillion. We didn't leave that money over there. That money supported probably 500,000 jobs or 1 million jobs in America. And when you drop a bomb, yeah, you've lost that iron and that high explosive, but the 57 people that worked on it to put it together, you know, they still have jobs and they're supporting families and so forth. So it's a little bit of a canard to talk about. If we close down the Defense Department tomorrow and close down all war industry, we'd have a depression in this country.
That's it.
So it's not,
Right, but I think part of the question is
it's priorities. It's priorities.
Are they influencing policy to? Did they influence policy to create a market for the product that they're selling? I mean, it's not. I don't argue whether they had factories in congressional districts or whether there's value in that. I think it becomes a problem if.
It's like the mergers of death.
Right.
In the 1930s,
That's very problematic.
Yeah, in the 1930s, the argument was that we got involved in World War I was because of the merchants of death, the guys, the war profiteers, and the munitions makers. And basically, the mistake people make is to assume that every defense industry is basically nothing but a war profiteer and basically a merchant of death. That basically they're pushing war. You know, that's really up to policymakers. Sometimes you make a military machine like, you know, we have, sometimes you want to use it. You know, but there's a tendency to use it as a means of last resort, not a first resort, or vice versa.
I would say, in a different context, not specifically Vietnam, but Eisenhower saw evidence of what could be influence. So he was commenting during the so-called arms gap, which Eisenhower knew, had intelligence, we were ahead of the Russians in missile technology, missile sites, that type of thing, but certain senators, such as Symington from Missouri and even John F. Kennedy to some extent, were claiming we were lagging behind. He had the intelligence just the way he wouldn't say why he knew, but he'd comment critically. Some of these munition makers seem to have an undue influence on some of these senators. That was the case where we saw possibly the influence of the military-industrial complex. I had to do more of the arms race than did this Vietnam specifically, but he was concerned about that type of thing.
The bomber gap, the missile gap, it was all basically made up.
And are you implying that Ike had enough character that he didn't leak intelligence information to dispel that politically? Yes, you are. Because the times have changed.
In reference to Ho Chi Minh, when I read the Vietnam War here, Ho Chi Minh was an avowed communist, but he always said that he didn't think the Vietnamese people would accept communism. And I don't think they have, really. They have a pretty aggressive society now that's not communist. My interpreter, who was with me by my side for my whole tour, I want to say this, his favorite person in the whole world was Abraham Lincoln. He knew more about Abraham Lincoln than I did. And I asked him one time in our downtime, I said, who's your favorite Vietnamese? And he said, Ho Chi Minh. And I said, you're telling me that Ho Chi Minh is your favorite Vietnamese and you're sitting beside me as my interpreter? And he said, yes, because he was the one that drove out the French. But I don't like him because he's an avowed communist. So they always had this kind of conflict, the Vietnamese, the French, the communists, and they kind of had to work among themselves on this. But I always thought it was interesting that Ho Chi Minh was, his favorite hero, and Abraham Lincoln overall was his favorite person. So this little side note on
Ho Chi Minh actually wrote to Harry Truman. He wrote to Harry Truman.
Did he?
He wrote to Harry Truman, well, first of all, he wrote to Truman asking Truman not to allow the French to come back to Indochina. And as a matter of fact, on the day of Vietnamese Independence Day in Hanoi, at the end of World War II, he quoted our Declaration of Independence. And the second letter was an apology for the death of Peter Dewey, the first American killed.
That was a mistake, Dewey was.
Yeah, they thought he was French because he spoke fluent French. He was in the OSS and had served in France during the war.
I have one, if you're interested in Ho Chi Minh's career, I've got one book by William Duker, it's entitled Ho Chi Minh, A Life. I'd recommend that. That gives you a very detailed look at Ho Chi Minh, his life, and also it helped me understand the fact at the time I went over there, Ho Chi Minh was not calling the shots.
No.
Le Duin,
Yeah, Le Duin, the guy up here.
He was a figurehead by the mid-'60s, even before that.
He was a Southerner and was determined to basically liberate South Vietnam. He was the one. He was the one that pressed for basically the Tet Offensive and also the Easter Offensive. And matter of fact, even negotiating with the North Vietnamese was basically a ruse. Now I don't know if many of you know this or not, but remember the argument we're having about collusion or not collusion with Trump and the Russians. Well, there was an issue that happened during the 1968 election. In November 2nd, 1968, there was possible break in the stalemate, and there may have been a negotiated settlement. The word reached Henry Kissinger, who then passed it on to Nixon, who then passed it on to Anna Schnault to contact Win Van Tu, that basically don't agree to anything that Johnson was going to come through. And he negated that. Johnson picked it up on an illegal wiretap and called in Everett Dirksen and told Dirksen, this is treason. And Dirksen said, yeah, it's treason, all right. But remember, Nixon had a secret plan to end the war. It took 5 years basically to come to fruition.
I think we have time for one more.
My daughter and son-in-law have been back to Vietnam twice and have traveled most of the country from north to south. And then I have many friends, ex-military friends, that have been back to Vietnam sometimes more than once. And the common thread of all their visits have been the extreme friendliness of the Vietnamese towards the Americans. And I'm just wondering whether you could have any reason or know why that could be, considering what we did and what they did to us. Why are they so friendly to us? Do you have any ideas?
Magnanimous in victory, maybe.
I don't know. I don't have any answer except there's something very touchy. Like, for example, maybe you've ever read the book "We Were Soldiers and Young" by Colonel Harold Moore.
Yeah.
But and if it's all about the horrendous battles of the Ai Drang Valley, I'd recommend that to anyone who wants to read how intense the Vietnam War was. Only the movie, but it only depicted one part, the Battle at LZ X-Ray. The worst part was at the second one at LZ Albany, where he walked in an ambush. But anyway, 20 years later, Harold Moore wrote another book, We Are Soldiers Still, and that time depicted his revisit Vietnam. He met with this General Ramon, who was his adversary at the Battle of Ai Drang, and there was a rather touching and feeling that reconciliation, even when they both regretted the horrible cost. But it is there, and that was a very touching experience. I'd recommend both those books for anyone who wants to explore that.
Oh, there's CBS, ABC did a piece on that when that book came out. And Chris Wallace narrated it for ABC, and they went back and they interviewed the Vietnamese, and it's like they were both brothers. I mean, if you read anything about Albany or X-Ray, I mean, it's horrible. I mean, it's blood curdling. And imagine after all of that, and talking about the men that they knew that died, and that they could still talk to each other. It's amazing.
I think the Vietnamese realized that our motivation and our efforts over there were noble from our perspective. We weren't colonizers. We were there for what we thought was a greater purpose and for the good. And on the human level, there were probably acts of kindness, the candies from the GIs and so forth. And so I think they probably all had a more positive connection to American GIs than they did to maybe the French colonists and so forth. So, and I think maybe those of you you talked about how Vietnam is not going to be much of a communist country because they're capitalists at heart, and you can see that. And I haven't been back there, but I'm wondering, those of you who have, I'm suspecting that they probably don't call it Ho Chi Minh City. I bet they still say Saigon, probably. I don't know. I could be wrong. I noticed that I looked up the airport designation for Ho Chi Minh International Airport. It's SGN, Saigon, which is a little consolation, I think.
One thing, they're a very forgiving people.
They are.
I was an advisor to them, and they could forgive you for anything that you did, but yet they could be a very horrific people. Their favorite deal was bury people alive because they didn't like them. If they really didn't like you, they'd bury you alive. But yet they could forgive your transgressions. And they're very humble people.
They were ferocious warriors. I mean, matter of fact, one scholar called them Asians Prussians. They were just a tremendous soldiers. Douglas Pike, I recommend, he did a book called PAVN, People's Army of Vietnam, and he did a book on the Viet Cong, which is pretty good. I think there's a question back there.
I can answer that man's question that he asked about why the Vietnamese felt so thankfulness for the Americans, because we were the only country that served over there that had compassion on the people.
Americans were the only person that served over in Vietnam that had compassion on the people himself.
May I answer that? The ROCs, the Republic of Korea, they didn't have compassion.
None at all. Totally agree.
If you wanted to go out and not have contact with the enemy, you'd go out with a rock.
Yeah, right.
You'd have a picnic because they completely avoided the rocks because they knew what would happen
Republic of Korea.
if the rocks would get a hold of them. And I want to tell you something. We're in this North Korea, South Korea thing. These South Koreans are tough customers.
Yeah.
I've seen them in action, and they're someone you want to be friends with. You don't want to be an adversary to them.
On the topic of forgiveness, my husband and I have worked for over 20 years with a group called Point Man Ministries, and a Christian organization, but we try to be very low-key about our faith. But at the same time, one of the things that we've seen a lot of is veterans that say, I think I've done too much to be forgiven. And so early on, we found these dog tags, and they had one word on it. It was cut out, and it said forgiven. And it's been really interesting over the years to be able to present those to those, especially the guys that have, this tremendous sense of guilt, I think, from the moral wounds that came along with, and the grief and all of the things that come, the layers that maybe had gone on in their lives prior to them going to the war and then coming home. And so I think that message of forgiveness is something that can provide a lot of healing.
Okay. I think it's time to break.
I'll ask one last question for my colleagues from your library experience. Did you find anything over the years in the records of the library that maybe changed your perception of the war, or even changed how you look back and think about your experience, and including the research that Dr. Levitt's done as well? Or maybe not.
It's given me a little perspective, I guess, and it probably has, but I really couldn't articulate. I don't think how it did, but I'm sure it has. It's still part of that sorting out process, which is still ongoing with me.
I came back to the library and began doing a research project looking at J. Lawton Collins and how American military attaches in Paris were pressing for supporting more a nationalist element in Vietnam rather than supporting Bao Dai, that was the French puppet emperor of Vietnam. And I find that amazing. As Americans feel we have a can-do attitude, we could solve this problem where the French really couldn't do it.
My my lessons from Eisenhower over the years, or his feelings that if you're going to fight a war, the most merciful way to do it is to use overwhelming force and get it over with quickly. You know, you don't, if you drag it out, more innocent people are going to die. When he was planning the invasion of Normandy, D-Day, the debate was up about whether to bomb the French rail lines that were going to support the Germans. You know, reinforcements would be coming in, and they were really concerned because up to 40,000 French civilians could be killed in these bombing strikes because we didn't have the accuracy back then that we do now. And Eisenhower said, we're not going to have an invasion if we don't do that. We're going to do that. Case closed. And he said, plus I think those estimates are high. And so they did indeed bomb those lines, and many hundreds died, but it wasn't nearly 40,000. But Ike said, if you're going to do this thing, you're going to do it to win. You know, you're not going to, you have one chance to be victorious.
That became the PAL doctrine too. Another Vietnam veteran that served in Vietnam.
Well, I just want to thank Professor Crisco and all of our great panel again. And I want to remind you all that we'll reconvene at 2 o'clock to hear more experiences from the Vietnam War. So thank you very much.
Good job.